Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today's lesson is part 2 of 1-5, 1-6, but the lesson is actually very different. Our goal today is that we will understand that the place value system is a base 10, and understanding this will allow me to manipulate or play with or work with numbers easier and do mental math. That's kind of what makes this lesson fun, is we're going to be doing a lot of mental math. This lesson is also extremely important because the next 2 lessons are going to depend on you understanding this. So this is very, very important for not only this lesson, but the 2 next lessons. Okay, our vocab words is a base 10 system. We saw this in the last video. Remember, we have a tens, hundredths, and thousandths, and a ones, tens, and hundreds. Notice I always work my way from the decimal. And I can represent this with numbers as well. So I have tenths, hundredths, thousandths, or ones, tens, or hundreds. Now, last time we saw this base 10 system is because when I jump from one place value to the next, it's times 10. If I jump from this place value to here, it's another times 10. Okay? And if I jump 2 place values, it's times 10 times another 10, which is why 2 place values is worth 100 times. Well, what we're going to see this time is actually when I even jump backwards, it's going to be a little different. So if I went from 100 to 10, I'm not actually multiplying anymore. I'm going to have to divide by 10 to get from 100 to 10. And how would I get from 10 to 1? Well, I would have to divide by 10. So that's just another reason why it's called a base 10 system. That also helps us understand down here why 1 place value is called 10 times and 2 place values called 100 times. Okay, our next 2 words are increase and decrease. Increase just means to make larger or bigger. And normally in math, we make things larger by adding or multiplying. For this lesson, it's going to be multiplying. When I multiply numbers, I usually increase the number. Decreases, I make smaller. And again, it's usually we think of subtraction or division makes numbers smaller. For today's lesson, it's going to be division. So usually when we divide, our number gets smaller. And I keep saying usually because you'll see in a few months why, that we're going to change that. But for today's lesson, increase, it gets by multiplication, and decrease by division. Okay, our next 2 words are product and quotient. All of these words are multiplication and division words. Product is the answer to a multiplication problem. It's just the answer. It's important to know that because you'll see that sometimes in word problems. It'll say, what is the product? It won't say, what is the answer? Okay, so for example, if I have 5 times 4, my product would be 20. These 2 numbers are factors. The numbers I multiplied together are factors, and my answer of a multiplication problem is a product. Quotient is the answer to a division problem. So here I have dividend divided by, notice how I fix that to be a division sign. Dividend divided by the divisor equals the quotient. So here, if I have 20 and I divide it by 4, my answer is 5. So the answer to the division problem is the quotient. Okay, next we have each place value is worth 10. So it's important to know that 1 place value is 10 times. Right up here, when I jumped 1 place value, it was 10 times. If I jump 2 place values, it's worth 100 times because times 10 would be 100 times. And if I jumped 3 place values, it's 1,000 times. Okay, remember that's going to help us here. Okay, the next one is, you're going to see an error here, so I apologize greatly for this. Let's fix this. Numbers on the, not the right, I'm so sorry. Numbers on the left have the greatest value. Okay, what that means is although all these 5s are the same digit, this 5 on the left has the greatest value. So I'm going to put a G there. And numbers on the right have the least value. This 5 is worth the least. If this was money, remember we would want this one, not this one. Okay, our next note to kind of help us is something we've talked about. When adding a decimal to the whole number, you must add it to the end so you don't change the value. So if I gave you 37 and I told you to add a decimal, if you add the decimal here, you've changed the value because here I had 37 holes and here I have no holes. So you can't do that. If you added it here, you've also changed the value because here you had 37 holes and here I only have 3 holes. So that's not allowed either. If I added the decimal here at the end, I didn't change the value at all because this is 37 holes and this is still 37 holes. So remember, we always add a decimal to the end. Okay, our steps today are right here. So first step is we're going to add a decimal to the number being multiplied or divided if needed. Some of our problems will already have one and some won't, so we'll just add it to the end if we need one. Step 2 is kind of the trickiest one. I'm going to put a star there because that's going to take a lot of focus. I'm going to first circle the operation. Okay, in math, there's 4 operations: adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing. We're working with multiplying and dividing today. So I'm going to circle the multiplication sign or the division sign. And then I'm going to ask myself, is my number going to decrease or increase? If I'm multiplying, it's probably going to increase. If I'm dividing, it's probably going to decrease. And then here's the hard part. Which direction do I need to move my decimal to make this happen? And I'll show you this in my examples. And then I'm going to draw an arrow on top of my sign telling me which direction I want to move my decimal. Okay. Step 3 is I'm going to move the decimal the correct number, oh, I spelled that wrong, I'm sorry, number of spaces. And what's going to determine your spaces is how many zeros you have. So I'm going to move the decimal the correct number of spaces using something called loops. Okay. Step 4 is I'm going to fill in my empty loops with zeros. Okay. And my last step is I'm going to rewrite my answer. Okay. So what does this actually look like? Let's look at a couple of them. Okay. My first one, I'm going to show you, but I'm going to leave my steps up so you can look at my steps when I show you. Okay, my first one is this. Okay, 45 divided by 100. Okay, so my first step says add a decimal to the number being multiplied or divided if needed. Well, this is my number that's being divided, and it doesn't have a decimal, so I do need one. So I'm going to add one right here to the end. Okay, my second step says I'm going to circle the operation. Okay, and then I'm going to ask myself, is my number going to decrease or increase? Well, if I divide something by 100, I expect it to get a lot smaller if you divide it by 100. So I expect it to decrease. My next question then is, which direction should I move my decimal to make this happen? Well, I'm going to be moving my decimal, and I'm going to pick up a pencil here to show you. If I moved my decimal this way and put it here, did I make that number get smaller? Well, it was 45 and now it's 45 hundredths. Or my other choice is if I move it this way, I now have 4500. So I have 4,500 holes. So which direction made it smaller or decrease? Hopefully you saw that when I moved it here, it decreased. Now, I normally just do this kind of in my head. I kind of play with my hands and go, ooh, if I move it this way, it's going to be here, and if I move it this way. So I need to move it that way because I need my number to get smaller, to decrease, because I'm dividing it by 100. Okay, step 3 says I'm going to move the decimal the correct number of spaces, and that's determined by my zeros using something called loops. So I had 2 zeros, so I'm going to move it 1, 2 spaces, and I'm going to put it right there. It's no longer there. So my next step says fill in the empty loop with zeros. I don't have any empty loops. And my last step says rewrite my answer. So I have decimal point 4, 5. That decimal point I took away because I moved it. This is my answer. And that makes sense. If I had 45 and I had to divide it between 100, every person wouldn't get a whole one. Think about if you had 45 cakes and divided it between 100 people. No one's going to get a whole one. There's going to only be parts. Okay, let's try another one. Okay, this one, if I get my paper ready, thanks for being patient, looks like this. Step 1 says I'm going to add my decimal to the number being multiplied or divided if needed. Well, this number is being multiplied by 10, and it already has a decimal, so I don't need to do that. Step 2 is my hard step. I'm going to circle my operation, and then I'm going to ask myself, do I think my number is going to decrease or increase? Well, if I multiply a number by 10, I expect it to increase, to get bigger. So which direction should I move this to make that happen? Which direction would you move this to make this number, 2600ths, get bigger? Okay, hopefully you see that I need to move it that way, because if I move it this way, I'm going to get some numbers in front, some numbers at whole numbers. Okay, step 3 is, now I'm going to move the decimal the correct number of spaces, and that's determined by my 0 here, using loops. So I'm going to move it 1. Notice this 0 didn't count, it was this 0. So I'm going to move it 1 space to the right. It's going to go right there, no longer there. Okay, my next step says fill in the empty space with zeros. I don't have any empty loops, they're all full. So now I'm going to rewrite my answer. So this is what I have. Well, I really don't need that 0, so a better choice of how to write that would look like that. And that makes sense, that this number got bigger because I multiplied it by 10. Okay, let's try some. So grabbing your pencil, let me grab my paper. Okay, and I'm going to keep my steps in front of me to help me. Okay. So number 1 says add a decimal to the number being multiplied or divided if needed. I already have a decimal. Step 2 is I'm going to circle my operation and say, ooh, if I multiply something by 100, it's going to increase. It's going to get bigger. So I'm going to move this which way to get bigger. I'm going to have to move it to the right. Step 3 says I'm going to move it the correct number of spaces. So I'm going to move it 2 spaces. So ready? 1, 2. Notice how I had to kind of go down there. So I moved it from here to here. This one doesn't count anymore. Now, step 4 says fill in your empty loops with zeros. I actually have an empty loop right here. So I need to put that there. Step 5 says rewrite it. So I have 160 decimal. Well, I actually don't need that decimal, so I'm just going to say 160. Okay, the next one says 65 divided by 10. It doesn't have a decimal, so we're going to add one. I'm going to circle my operation and say, ooh, it's going to get smaller if I divide by 10. So which direction do I need to move to go smaller? I'm going to have to go that way. And I'm going to move it 1 space, I'm on step 3, right here. Oop, there's barely any room to squeeze it in. And I have no empty loops. So step 5 is I'm going to rewrite my answer, and it's 6.5, and the decimal that I put there no longer counts. So my answer is 6 5/10. All right, good luck.